That, in my mind, is what this government means by global Britain.
"7,000 refugees from Cameroon registered with the UNHCR. Thousands more have been forced to flee their homes, and dozens of villages have been ethnically cleansed. According to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and High Commissioner for Refugees, 437,000 from the Anglophone regions have been displaced, whilst the charity Protection Approaches says that 3.3 million are in need of humanitarian assistance. Amnesty reports that 450 to 500 civilians and 185 members of the security services have been killed. UNICEF estimates that 58 schools have been destroyed, 47 political leaders are being held without charge, and a recent Amnesty report refers to, and I quote, arbitrary arrests, torture, unlawful killings and the destruction of property. The Catholic Bishops' Conference has called it, quote, inhuman, blind, monstrous violence. And of the October election, Archbishop Samuel Cleda, the president of the Bishops' Conference, says, one has the impression election results are decided before voting takes place. My Lords, we can all share in these horrendous statistics, but what I want to do is this evening focus on what conclusions we can draw from the United Kingdom's dismal approach to this situation. More than ever, with Britain's potential departure from the European Union, we must seek to define our role in the world, and it would be helpful to know from the Noble Baroness the Minister whether, for instance, human rights issues were assessed before, for instance, the New Age natural gas deal was announced, what consideration has been given to targeted sanctions, and whether this crisis figures in the Foreign Secretary's recent commitment on atrocity prevention. My Lords, the government mustn't suggest that this is a level playing field conflict in a civil war between equal sides. Too often in the past, in Bosnia, in Rwanda, in Darfur, the United Kingdom chose the path of moral equivalence, hinting that both sides are as bad as each other is the easy way out. In a previous generation, this was known as appeasement. Moral equivalence signals that we cannot be expected to pass judgment on which side is more to blame for the conflict. Instead, we issue the usual calls for a cessation of violence and a negotiated settlement, or we frame political conflicts as if they were natural disasters requiring aid, and we're very generous at sending aid rather than political solutions. At its worst, in Rwanda, Bosnia and Darfur, we have portrayed the persecution of unarmed civilians by repressive governments as a result of ancient ethnic hatreds, thereby dehumanising the victims and denying the legitimacy of the protesters who yearn for the rights that we take for granted. By citing ancient ethnic hatreds, we absolve ourselves of the wringing our hands in dismay or putting British boots on the ground. This is to ignore the potential for soft power available to the international community, be it concerted and sustained diplomatic pressure, carefully targeted sanctions, or international justice. The grievances fueling the violence in Cameroon did not erupt overnight. Not to listen to Cameroon's Anglophone minority. Anglophones represent 20% of the population, but for years there was only one Anglophone member of the 36-person cabinet in Yaoundé, just one example of their systematic marginalisation. My Lords, we shouldn't underestimate the influence we have, but it speaks volumes that we left it to the American ambassador to express his disapproval of the Cameroonian government's brutal response to peaceful protests. For decades, the Francophone government has ignored the pleas of moderate representatives of civil society, such as church leaders. Calls for a federal solution were ignored by President Biya, 36 years in power, fueling the calls for secession and thereby polarising opinion. Breaking point came when the Francophone government sought to impose French laws in the French language in Anglophone courts and sent Francophone teachers speaking French into English schools. They responded to peaceful protest with disproportionate force. The International Crisis Group reports that a government helicopter, for instance, hovered outside a church, shooting Anglophone worshippers as they emerged from Mass. Inevitably, disproportionate actions led to the current escalation. In the face of all this, my lords, there is nothing admirable about being even-handed in the face of the suffering of the Anglophone community. The United Kingdom should support the Anglophone community's peaceful civil society leaders in seeking genuine and inclusive talks. We need a targeted strategy for atrocity prevention and, my lords, a commitment to bring to justice those responsible for human rights violations wherever they occur.
My Lords, I too would like to thank my noble friend Lord Boateng for initiating this debate and too for his passionate introduction. I don't want to background to the complex and contested decolonisation process that he referred to, but as my noble friend Lord McConnell highlighted, particularly since the federal arrangements were scrapped in '72, the English-speaking Cameroonians have complained bitterly that they are politically, economically and linguistically marginalised. And of course the current period of escalating violence and displacement goes back to when lawyers protested.
On the 7th of June this year, the Guardian newspaper ran a special feature on the brutal campaign of violence by the regime of Cameroon's President Biya against English-speaking communities in the west of the country, which were formerly known as British Cameroon, communities to whom we owe a historic responsibility. They quoted in The Guardian the ordinary men and women who saw their villages attacked by Biya's military, who saw their neighbours and family members killed, and that they were forced to flee for their lives. They quoted the charity workers who were looking after thousands of displaced women and children for whom they warned going home would be suicide. Now, by any normal moral standard, you would expect the UK government to read those reports and be appalled. But not this government. The very next day after that report was published, the British Trade Secretary announced a £1.5 billion deal with a British national gas company and President Biya's regime. A deal which, in the words of the Trade Department's press release, generate a huge stream of revenue for Cameroon's public treasury. In other words, we have a regime ranked as the 25th most corrupt in the world, a ruler in his 43rd year of autocratic power, with a personal wealth of over $200 million, engaged in a systematic campaign of brutality and killings against English-speaking community in his country, and all the government can do is boast of doing trade deals which will only enrich him further. That.
The United Kingdom remains deeply concerned by the ongoing crisis in the northwest and southwest regions of Cameroon, which SRSG Fall described. The impacts on civilians continue to be profound. The conflict in this region has driven around 770 has exacerbated humanitarian needs across the country. In September, the United Kingdom announced a further $6 million to fund humanitarian actions in Cameroon. This funding will thousands of vulnerable people and brings our total humanitarian support to Cameroon in 2020 to $18 million. We remain deeply concerned by reports of human rights violations and abuses committed by both security forces and armed separatists, violence against civilians. The killing of 7 children by unidentified gunmen in Kumba in October was particularly shocking. We continue to support the Secretary-General's call on armed actors not to attack civilians, and we call for an end to violence and for unhindered humanitarian access. The UK urges respect by all parties for human rights, including freedom of religion, freedom of expression, association and assembly. We continue to urge full cooperation by the Government of Cameroon with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I commend the steps taken by the Government of Cameroon to address the crisis and respond to the recommendations grand dialogue in October 2019, including the holding of regional elections on the 6th of December. These elections were an important step towards decentralisation, remains pivotal in achieving a just, peaceful and durable resolution to the Northwest-Southwest crisis, which meets the reasonable demands of the moderate majority. All parties should remain engaged in good faith in dialogue and peace-building efforts, including the Swiss-led efforts to facilitate talks between the Government of Cameroon and separatist groups. I hope that Cameroon's international and regional friends and partners will also continue to support efforts to restore peace and security in the Northwest and Southwest regions.
He'll be the president in 2019.
Wow. At the time, the way the election that I observed